We have read a tall tale about Paul Bunyan, who was a lumberjack who made an axe from the top of a tree and had a pet ox named Babe. And we read about Pecos Bill, who was a cowboy who tamed a mountain lion and rode a cyclone. Today, we are going to learn about yet another tall tale character. This one's name is John Henry. So remember, tall tales have exaggerations, are funny or humorous, and they usually take place in the American frontier. As people continued to move westward in the United States, new transportation systems were being invented, and older transportation systems became faster and less expensive. One form of transportation that made traveling much easier was the railroad and trains. Tracks for trains were laid by thousands of workers. Tunnels were even dug right through the mountains, mostly by hand. This was difficult work. Soon, however, machines were invented that could do what people were doing, and the machines could do the work easier and faster. The tall tale we'll hear today is very interesting because for over 100 years, we didn't know if the character of John Henry was a real person. For many years, people believed John Henry was a fictional hero and a symbol for those who worked laying railroad tracks. But today, some historians, or people who study history, now believe that there really was a man named John Henry who really did lay railroad tracks, and that the main event in the story actually happened. But because it's a tall tale, there might be, even if it did actually happen, it'll probably be exaggerated a little bit. In the 1860s, when John Henry's story takes place, the United States was growing quickly. Immigrants were pouring in, and railroad companies were laying train tracks that would carry settlers west. The word tracks sometimes means impressions left on the ground by an animal or a person, but here, tracks means the metal bars that a train rides along. One of the railroad companies was called the Chesapeake and Ohio, or the C&O for short. The C&O Railroad was named for the two bodies of water it was intended to connect, the Chesapeake Bay along the east coast and the Ohio River in the west. Today, railroads cross the whole country. So if we look at our map, we can kind of see where the black lines start, in the Chesapeake Bay in the east. So remember, that's going to be east is on the right side. And it goes all the way over to the Ohio River, which is on the west side of the map. Let's go over some of our vocabulary words before we start. Our first word is feats. When the word feats is spelled F-E-A-T-S instead of two E's in the middle, we're not talking about the things at the bottom of your legs. Feats, when it's spelled this way, are achievements that require courage or strength. Painting the outside of their house and building a new fence were big feats, but the Hernandez family managed to finish before the rain. See if you can think of a time where you have accomplished a big feat. See if you can think of a feat that either Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill achieved. Challenge. A challenge is a difficult task or problem that takes some thinking to figure out. For example, putting a puzzle together can sometimes be a challenge. Take a minute to see if you can think of any time you have overcome some kind of difficult challenge. Let's go through some examples and see if they are a challenge or not. Remember, different things are hard for different people. So something that might be challenging to you might not be a challenge for someone else. So let's see, standing on one foot Is that a challenge for you? What about singing the ABCs backwards? What about writing your name? Patting your head while rubbing your tummy? Writing your name with your eyes closed? Touching your finger to your nose while jumping up and down and standing on one foot? Writing your name upside down with your eyes closed? Compete. To compete means to try to be better than someone else at something. For example, the athletes at the Olympics compete to be the best in their event. Solution. A solution is something that solves a problem. Wearing an extra coat is a good solution to the problem of being cold. Steam. Steam is the hot air and water droplets created when water is very hot. When you take a shower, sometimes the steam from the shower gets on the bathroom mirror. The engineers who planned the C&O Railroad had to overcome many challenges in order to get the trains from Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River. But no challenge was greater than this. They had to run their tracks through the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachians were like a big wall that separated the East from the West. Sometimes, when the mountains were rolling, more like hills, the C&O workers were able to lay tracks over the top of them. Other times, they were able to lay track that zigzagged around the mountains, like a snake. But some mountains were too tall to go over and too big to go around. In those cases, the only solution was to dig a tunnel right through the mountain. So remember, a challenge is a problem, and the solution is something that solves the problem. So the solution to the problem of having the mountains be too big and too tall was to dig a tunnel through the middle. Digging tunnels was dangerous work. The tunnels were dark and poorly ventilated. That means that there was barely enough fresh air inside for the tunnels for the workers to breathe. Many workers were killed by sudden cave-ins. Cave-ins are when pieces of rock fall down into a tunnel. To dig the tunnels as fast as they could, railroad workers worked in teams of 2. One man would crouch down and hold a steel spike. Spikes are long, thick nails used to hold railroad tracks together. Then the other man would hit the spike with a big hammer. The first man would twist the spike as much as he could. Then his partner would hit the spike with his hammer again. The 2 men would work together, banging and twisting, until they had driven the spike deep into the rock. Then they would pull out the spike, move to another spot, and start digging a new hole. The men would create a hole in the rock by hand, without the help of any kind of complex machine. After a while, the rock would be full of holes, like a piece of Swiss cheese. Next, the dynamite men would take over. Dynamite is a substance that explodes when it burns. The dynamite men would pack dynamite into the holes and detonate the explosives. Kaboom! Detonate means to set off. The explosions would break up the solid rock into rubble. Then the workers would haul away the rubble, and then they would start digging again. To make the long, hard day's work go by faster, the railroad workers used to have contests. They would pick 2 teams and see which team could drive its spike farther into the mountain in a set amount of time. The winners of these contests became heroes. People would tell stories about these steel-driving men and their amazing feats. So remember, feats are accomplishments that take great strength and determination. I think being able to drive those heavy spikes into the rock really quickly would be a pretty amazing feat. Another thing the railway workers did to pass the time while they were working was sing songs. Sometimes they would even sing songs about other steel-driving men. One of these steel-driving men was named John Henry. No one knew for certain where John Henry was from. Some said that he was from Georgia. Some said he was from Tennessee. Others said he was a Virginia man. As it turns out, it seems likely that he had been enslaved before the Civil War. He seems to have started working on the railroads sometime after the end of the Civil War. For years, people thought John Henry worked on the Big Bend Tunnel on the C&O line in West Virginia, but now we think he more likely worked on the Lewis Tunnel in Virginia. One thing we are sure of is that John Henry was a legend among railway workers. A legend is someone who is well known for doing something extremely well. A legend is also a story that is believed to be true, like this one. They sang a song that tells the story about how he was born with a hammer in his hand. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I've never heard of a baby being born holding a hammer, so I kind of think that's probably an exaggeration. John Henry became known as the most courageous man who ever worked on the railroad. Even as a young boy, he could do the work of a full-grown man. So they're saying as a small boy he could do the work of older men. That is probably an exaggeration too, I think. They said he had never been defeated in a steel driving competition. They said he hit the spike so hard that sparks flew through the air. They said John Henry could swing a 10-pound hammer from sunup to sundown and not even get tired. I don't know, do you think that's an exaggeration too? I kind of think it might be. At first, almost all of the work on the tunnels was done by hand workers, like John Henry. Eventually, however, this began to change. People invented machines that could do some of the work. One of the machines they invented was a steam drill. This was a drill that was powered by a steam engine. How that works is very hot water changes to steam, and that steam powers the steam drill. The first steam drills were pretty good, but they weren't great. The steam drills could drive a spike into the mountain for sure, but not as well as two strong, experienced railway workers like John Henry and his partner. Over time, the machines got better and better, and they eventually began to replace the men who worked on the railroads. One day, the captain of John Henry's work team brought a steam drill to the work site. He bet that the steam drill could drive steel better than John Henry could. This machine was going to do the same job as John Henry and his crew, but faster. John Henry agreed to compete against the steam drill, and he swore he would do his best to beat it. John Henry said to the captain, "Well, a man ain't nothing but a man, but before I let a steam drill beat me down, I'll die with a hammer in my hand. Oh, I'll die with a hammer in my hand." One of the bosses blew a whistle. John Henry went to work driving steel the old-fashioned way, with a hammer and a spike. The captain started up the steam drill. It rattled away beside John Henry, belching steam and banging away at the mountain. The man and the machine worked side by side for several hours. Then the boss blew his whistle again. The boss took measurements, and then they announced the results. Who do you think is going to win, John Henry or the drill? John Henry had driven his spike a total of 15 feet into the mountain, and the steam drill, it had only drilled 9 feet. If John Henry dug 15 and the steam drill dug 9, which one dug farther? It was John Henry. John Henry had won. He had beaten the steam drill. Now the man that invented the steam drill, he thought he was mighty fine, but John Henry drove his 15 feet, and the steam drill only made 9. Oh, the steam drill only made 9. The other railway workers roared. John Henry received a cheer as loud as a roar. They were excited that John Henry had won. He had shown that a hard worker was better than a machine. But John Henry himself was in no condition to celebrate. He had worked so hard that he had suffered a heart attack. John Henry hammered in the mountains, and his hammer was striking fire. Well, he hammered so hard that it broke his poor heart, and he laid down his hammer, and he died. Oh, he laid down his hammer, and he died. The railwaymen carried John Henry out of the tunnel. They laid him to rest with the other workers who had died. But the legend of John Henry lived on. The C&O Railroad was completed a couple of years later, and for years to come, whenever locomotive is another word for train, went down the C&O line past the tunnel, they thought that John Henry helped dig. Those who knew the story would say, "There lies John Henry, the king of the steel-driving men." They took John Henry down the tunnel, and they buried him in the sand. And every locomotive that comes a-roarin' by says, "Yonder lies a steel-driving man. Oh, yonder lies a steel-driving man." Okay, there were a couple points in our story today that sounded like the end there. It's a little bit different from the rest of the story because they rhymed. That's because those excerpts came from the Ballad of John Henry. A ballad is a kind of song that tells a story. So this ballad was telling the story of John Henry. In our story today, we talked about how railroad companies were laying train tracks that would carry settlers west. The correct picture for that sense of the word tracks is shown in number 1. But tracks can also mean other things, like the marks left on the ground by an animal, person, or vehicle. The picture that shows the correct sense of this word is picture number 2. Tracks can also mean follows or watches the path of something. For example, a meteorologist tracks the storm to let people know when the bad weather will arrive. This is shown in picture 3. Hello again, everybody. We just finished our story about John Henry, and I have some questions for you. In the story, John Henry competed against a steam drill to see who could cut through the mountain fastest. Who won that competition? Yes, it was John Henry that won. A steam drill is a machine that was invented to cut through the mountain so that people didn't have to. Why did people start using steam drills so much instead of people? Yes, it was dangerous work for people, and it was really hard for people to do what a steam drill could do. The steam drill could also do it much more quickly than most people could. What was something that was amazing about John Henry's childhood? Yes, he was born with a hammer already in his hand, ready to go. What amazing adventures or feats, what amazing feat did John Henry accomplish? He was able to beat the steam drill because he could work harder, faster, and longer than any of the other men on the railroad. What parts of this story could happen in real life? Yes, in real life, people did build railroad tracks and dig tunnels through mountains. This tell-tale today was a little bit different than the last two that we've read. What are some ways that this was different than the other two stories we heard? Oh, you guys are right. This story is a little bit different because unlike Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill, this story was based on a real-life person that actually lived and worked on the railroads. Because this was based on a real-life person, there wasn't as much exaggeration, and he didn't go on quite as many adventures. He also didn't invent anything new, the way Pecos Bill invented a snake lasso.
but he was still a larger-than-life character. He was stronger and faster than all other men. This was based on a true story, but the way it's told has been fictionalized, so there are some parts of this story that are not true. It included some exaggeration, but not as much as our past stories. There was some things that were humorous in our story, and it took place on the frontier, on the railroad tracks, to help people move westward. Alright, my friends, we are now going to fill out our Tall Tale character chart. We're going to fill out our John Henry column. I'm going to jump on my computer screen so I can help you out. Okay, so on your chart, it won't be the answers you put in last time, but the ones that I did. So your answers might be a little bit different, but that's okay. Let's look today at John Henry, who we just read about. Remember, we're going to do our text box, and we're going to have to use a smaller font size so we can fit everything in our boxes. So John Henry, we're going to start with his amazing childhood. What's something amazing about John Henry's childhood? Yeah, some things that you could put in there were that he was born with a hammer in his hand. Ooh, that's too small. We'll do a little bit bigger than that. John Henry was born with a hammer in his hand. Or, as a child, he could do the work of a full-grown man. Those are both pretty amazing things about his childhood. I just wish that really take in there. Alright. When in Creations and Inventions, for John Henry, we're actually going to leave that one blank, because in our story, he didn't create or invent anything new. So we won't put anything in that box for today. Amazing adventures. There weren't as many amazing adventures in this story because it is based on a real person. But one thing that was amazing in our story, I think, was when he beat the steam drill. Something funny. See if you can think of something that you found funny about John Henry's story. Remember, John Henry's story didn't have quite as much humor as our other stories because there weren't a lot of exaggerations. Most of the humor in Tall Tales comes from the exaggerations, all of the crazy exaggerations that Tall Tales make. But because John Henry was a real person, and it was based on his life, there isn't as many exaggerations, and not quite as much humor. Let's see if you can think of something that you found humorous or funny from our story, and put it in that box. And while there weren't as many exaggerations, there were some that could be included in this last box. See if you can think of some of the few examples of exaggeration that we did have in John Henry, and put them in that last box. When you are finished, you will hit the turn in button up at the top, and that is our last thing that is due today. So once you are done with that, you are all finished with knowledge for today. Alright, my friends, thank you for staying with me. Have a good rest of your day.